is Caleb, and I was 27 years old when this happened. At the time, I was trying to build a career in radio after spending several years working at small stations across the southern United States. I had just accepted a job at an AM radio station located in a small town in rural Arkansas. It was the kind of place where almost everyone knew each other. The streets were practically empty after 10 at night, and a large portion of the population lived on farms or rural properties scattered for miles around the town. The station had surprisingly wide coverage for a municipality of that size. During the night, the signal reached isolated rural areas where many people still depended on AM radio for news, weather forecasts, and companionship through the late hours. I had only been working there for 2 weeks when everything happened. My shift started at 11 at night and ended at 5 in the morning. Most of the time, I was alone in the building. There was a small broadcasting room, an administrative office that sat empty during those hours, and a break room with a coffee machine that looked like it had been there since the 1980s. It was a quiet routine. I played old country music, read local news, reported road conditions, and answered calls from listeners. Until that night, nothing truly strange had happened. That particular night, listener activity was higher than usual. A storm front was moving across part of the state. So many people were calling to ask about weather conditions or report problems on rural roads. Around 12:30 in the morning, I received a call that initially seemed ordinary. An older man asked my name, confirmed that I was the new announcer, and then asked a strange question. He wanted to know whether I was familiar with certain long-established families in the region. I told him I was still getting to know the town. There was a brief silence before he said something that left me confused. He told me to avoid mentioning certain surnames during the broadcast, especially if anyone called requesting announcements or messages involving those families. When I asked why, he replied only that it was better for me not to get involved in old matters connected to the town. I assumed it was some kind of local rivalry and continued the program normally. But about 20 minutes later, another listener called, then another. None of them seemed to know one another. Even so, they all repeated similar versions of the same warning. They told me not to mention certain names on the air and to ignore any stories involving specific rural properties outside town. At first, I thought someone was playing a prank on the new announcer. But the more calls came in, the less it felt like a joke. Around 2 in the morning, the calls slowed down and the program returned to normal. I was still thinking about the strange warnings when I queued up a series of songs and started organizing notes for the next segment. The radio station building was old and made plenty of noises during the night. The ventilation system rattled, doors creaked with temperature changes, and the transmitter produced a constant hum that eventually became part of the atmosphere. It was then that the main phone line rang again. I answered, expecting another comment about the weather. On the other end, I heard a woman breathing rapidly. She sounded frightened. At first, I thought the call was breaking up, because it took her several seconds to speak. When she finally managed to, she said she needed help. Her voice trembled so badly that some words were almost impossible to understand. She explained that she lived in a rural area outside town and that someone was trying to get into her house. I asked if she had already called the police. She said she had, but nobody had arrived. As she spoke, I could hear noises in the background. They weren't loud, but they sounded like impacts coming from a door or a window. The woman started crying. She said she was locked inside a bedroom and that the exterior lights had been shut off a few minutes earlier. This was already far more serious than any normal late-night call I had ever received. I tried to stay calm and asked for her address so I could contact emergency services again. She began to answer, but before she could finish, I heard a strange noise on the line. It didn't sound like ordinary interference. It sounded like another voice coming through over the call. Very faint, almost a whisper. I couldn't make out the words at the time because I was focused on the woman. She finally started giving the address when I heard a loud crash somewhere on her end. Immediately afterward, she let out a short scream. The call disconnected instantly. I stared at the phone for several seconds, unable to believe what had just happened. I tried calling back immediately, but the call wouldn't go through. I tried several more times. Nothing. Then I looked up the local police number and explained the entire situation. I expected urgency on the other end. I expected questions, requests for information, or some attempt to locate the woman. Instead, the reaction was completely different. The officer who answered listened to my account in silence and asked only a few basic questions. Then there was a long pause. After that, he said something I still haven't forgotten. He told me that I had probably misunderstood the situation, and that it would be best if I continued doing my job at the radio station. When I insisted that the woman sounded like she was in real danger, he replied that there was nothing I could do, and that I should forget about the call. The conversation ended only seconds later. After hanging up, I sat staring at the broadcast console, unable to focus on anything else. I had worked in radio for several years and had received strange calls before. Drunk people, prank calls, confused listeners, and bizarre stories. But this was different. The woman sounded genuinely terrified, and the police response disturbed me even more than the call itself. I continued the broadcast because I had no choice, but during music blocks I kept trying to call her number. None of the calls connected. Sometimes the line seemed dead. Other times it simply dropped. The rest of the night passed strangely. Very few calls came in after that, and the ones that did were brief. Some listeners seemed nervous when they realized I was still on the air. One man even asked whether I had received any unusual calls that night. When I said yes, he hung up immediately. Around 4 a.m, I began mentally reviewing everything that had happened. That was when I remembered the strange sound I had heard before the call disconnected. Since all broadcasts were automatically recorded by the station, I decided that once my shift ended, I would listen to that segment again to better understand what had happened. Shortly after 5 a.m, the program ended. The sky was beginning to brighten, and a light rain was falling over the nearly empty station parking lot. Instead of going home, I went straight to the small room where the recording system stored broadcast archives. I found the time of the call and put on a pair of headphones. On the first playback, I heard essentially the same thing I had heard live. The woman speaking, the noises in the background, and then the abrupt disconnection. But when I increased the volume and rewound several seconds to the point just before she began giving the address, I noticed something that made me stop the recording immediately. There were voices in the background. Not inside the woman's house, on the phone line itself. They were extremely faint, almost buried beneath the primary audio. I put the headphones back on and listened several times. I couldn't understand everything, but 2 things became clear. There were at least 2 different voices, and they were saying an address. The same address the woman started giving seconds later. The difference was that those voices said it first, several seconds before she opened her mouth to provide any location at all. I remember taking off the headphones and staring at the computer screen, trying to find a logical explanation. I considered a technical malfunction. I considered overlapping calls. I considered faulty equipment. But none of those explanations accounted for the fact that those voices knew the address before the woman herself mentioned it. I spent nearly an hour replaying that section of the recording. The more I listened, the more uncomfortable I became. The voices were real. There was no doubt about that. They were faint but clear enough to identify when the volume was turned all the way up. I wrote down the address and decided to make one final attempt before leaving. I called the local police again and explained what I had found on the recording. This time, the officer who answered did not sound surprised. In fact, he remained silent for several seconds before responding. I asked whether anyone had gone to the woman's residence. I asked whether she was okay. I even asked whether the address actually existed. None of those questions received a direct answer. Instead, he asked why I was still involved in the matter. Then he said that I was new in town and that some stories were better left forgotten. Before I could press further, he ended the call. That was the moment I began feeling something I hadn't felt before. Fear. Not fear of the recording, not fear of the woman. Fear of the people who seemed determined to prevent anyone from talking about it. When I finally left the station, it was already morning. The rain had stopped and a few stores were beginning to open. On my way to my apartment, I stopped at a diner where I usually had breakfast after my shift. The place was nearly empty. While waiting for my order, I overheard 2 men talking at a nearby table. One of them casually mentioned the same surname I had heard repeatedly during the calls the previous night. The other immediately changed expression and told him to lower his voice. Both men looked around before continuing their conversation. Maybe it was a coincidence, maybe it wasn't. But it was enough to convince me that the warnings I had received during the night were not some coordinated prank. That same week, I started looking for jobs in other towns. I never found out what happened to the woman from that phone call. I also never discovered why so many people seemed unwilling to discuss certain names and rural properties in the area. Before leaving the station, I made a copy of the recording and took it with me. Years later, I still have that file stored on an old hard drive. From time to time, I listen to it again, trying to find a rational explanation. I still haven't found one, and the detail that continues to bother me the most remains the same. Those voices knew exactly where the woman was before she ever said a single word about her address. Story 2. I was 34 years old when this happened, and I live in the Colorado Springs area of Colorado. That summer, I regularly visited some relatives who lived in a small mountain town about 3 hours from my home. It was a trip I had made many times before, and I knew the road well. That weekend, I had spent 2 days helping an elderly aunt with a few things on her property, and I was driving home alone in the early evening. The forecast called for rain, but nothing that seemed particularly concerning. Even so, as I made my way through the mountains, the weather began deteriorating rapidly. The clouds became extremely dark, and the rain went from a light drizzle to a heavy storm in less than half an hour. The windshield wipers were running at full speed, and visibility was still poor. The road was narrow, full of curves, and surrounded by dense forest on both sides. In many sections, there was no street lighting at all. I was focused solely on driving safely and getting home before the storm became even worse. It was on one of those curves that I saw someone walking along the shoulder. At first, I thought it was a log or some object because the rain made it difficult to see anything clearly. But as I got closer, I realized it was a young man. He looked to be in his early 20s, completely soaked, and was walking with his head lowered against the wind. I drove past him and continued for a few seconds. Then I started thinking that it didn't make sense. There were no gas stations, houses, or nearby towns. The temperature was dropping quickly and the rain was getting heavier. I eventually turned around in a safe area a short distance ahead and pulled up beside him. When I rolled down the window, he seemed surprised that I had stopped. I asked if he needed help, and he simply replied that he needed to get farther down the highway. His voice was calm, but he sounded exhausted. I unlocked the door and he quickly got in. Water dripped from his clothes onto the seat, and the interior of the car immediately filled with the smell of wet earth and damp forest. I expected some kind of thank you or an explanation of what had happened, but instead he just fastened his seatbelt, took a deep breath, and stared straight ahead in silence. The first few minutes were awkward precisely because of that silence. I tried making conversation a few times, asking if his car had broken down or if he needed to call someone. His answers were always brief. He would simply say that everything was fine, or that he would deal with it later. Since the storm was intense, I eventually turned my attention back to the road. Even so, I began noticing behavior that made me uncomfortable. The young man spent much of the time looking through the rear window. It wasn't occasional. Every few seconds, he turned his head to look behind us as if checking for something. At first, I assumed he was worried that someone might be looking for him. But as the minutes passed, it began to seem more serious. Sometimes he even leaned across the seat to get a better view through the rain-covered glass. I could tell from the reflection in the mirror that he was tense. His hands remained clenched tightly on his legs and his shoulders were rigid. I asked if everything was okay, and he quickly replied that it was. But his voice wasn't convincing. Something was clearly wrong, although I couldn't say exactly what. About 20 minutes later, we reached an even more isolated section of highway. The rain was still coming down heavily, and there were virtually no other vehicles on the road. That was when he spoke more than he had during the entire trip. Pointing toward a narrow dirt road branching off to the right, he asked me to turn off my headlights and pull in there for a few minutes. I thought I had misunderstood him. I asked why, and he replied that he needed to get out of someone's sight. A cold feeling immediately settled in my stomach. I told him I wasn't driving down some dark dirt road in the middle of a storm. He insisted. He said it was important. When I refused again, his demeanor changed completely. For the first time since getting into the car, he showed genuine panic. He turned around and began looking through the rear window almost desperately. Then he said something that made me grip the steering wheel tighter. He said that someone had been following both of us for several miles. I immediately checked the rearview mirror. At first, I saw nothing except rain, but a few seconds later I noticed headlights appearing in the distance around a curve behind us. And in that moment, I didn't know whether I should be more concerned about the stranger sitting beside me or whoever was coming up behind us. My level of alertness instantly went through the roof. I was alone on a mountain road during a storm, with a stranger in my car telling me someone was following us. I tried to think rationally. The lights behind us could simply belong to another driver using the same highway. That was a perfectly normal explanation. The problem was the young man's reaction. The moment he saw those headlights, he became visibly shaken. He began alternating his gaze between the rearview mirror and the sides of the road as if searching for an escape route. I directly asked who might be following him. For the first time since getting into the car, he hesitated before answering. When he finally spoke, he said only that he wasn't sure. That didn't help at all. I wanted a clear explanation. I wanted to know whether I was transporting someone involved in a crime, whether he had gotten into a fight with someone, or whether he was fleeing some dangerous situation. Instead, I got vague answers. Meanwhile, the headlights behind us seemed to be gradually getting closer. Not aggressively, but quickly enough for me to notice. The rain continued pounding the windshield, and the constant sound of water mixed with the tires cutting through it made the atmosphere even more tense. A few minutes later, the vehicle behind us was much closer. Now I could distinguish two bright headlights piercing through the curtain of rain. The young man again asked me to leave the highway. This time, his voice was trembling. He said that if we kept going, it would end badly. I asked exactly what he meant by that. He didn't answer. He simply kept looking behind us. That was when I noticed another strange detail. The vehicle following us made no attempt to pass even when there was plenty of room. It also never slowed down. It maintained virtually the same distance for long stretches of time. That began to bother me. I grabbed my phone to see whether I had service and could call someone. No signal, not a single bar. The young man noticed what I was doing and immediately asked whether I had managed to get a connection. When I told him no, he closed his eyes for a second and muttered a curse under his breath. I could feel my heart beating faster and faster. There was a growing sense that I was trapped in the middle of a situation of which I knew less than half the story. And the worst part was that I couldn't trust either side. I decided I was not leaving the highway under any circumstances. My only priority at that point was finding a place with other people around. I kept driving and started looking for any gas station, restaurant, or even a road maintenance area. The young man noticed what I was doing and asked where I was going. I told him I would stop only somewhere populated. For the first time, he seemed to agree with something I said. That immediately caught my attention. If he really intended to harm me, he probably would have continued insisting that I take the dirt road. Instead, he fell silent and returned to watching the rearview mirror. About 15 minutes later, I spotted a small truck stop that operated 24 hours a day. The illuminated sign felt like an enormous relief that night. There were several trucks parked there and plenty of lights around the main building. The moment I pulled into the parking lot, I felt a small sense of safety returning. What happened next, however, made everything even stranger. The vehicle that had been behind us entered the parking lot only seconds later. My stomach dropped immediately. It wasn't a coincidence. That car really had been following the same route we had. As soon as I stopped near the diner entrance, the young man opened the door before I had even turned off the engine. He quickly looked across the parking lot and then toward the car that had just parked several spaces behind us. I will never forget the expression on his face in that moment. It was pure fear, not anger, not ordinary nervousness. It looked like someone who genuinely believed he was about to be found. Without saying a single word, he jumped out and ran toward the building. I sat in the car for a few seconds trying to understand what was happening. Moments later, I saw two people exit the other vehicle. They were both men wearing dark raincoats. They looked toward the diner entrance and then quickly headed inside. At that point, I made the decision not to stay around and find out the rest of the story. I entered the establishment only long enough to tell an employee that something strange was happening in the parking lot and that it might be a good idea to call the police. Then I returned to my car. As I drove away, I saw police vehicles entering the property from the highway. I never found out who the young man was, who those men were, or what was really going on. What I do know is that during several miles of isolated mountain highway in Colorado that night, I was caught between someone who was clearly hiding something and people who seemed determined to find him. and to this day I still can't say which side represented the greater danger. Story 3. I've been a truck driver for more than 15 years, and I spend a large part of my life traveling the highways of the American Southwest. This happened to me in the summer of 2021 during a freight run between Arizona and Texas. At the time, I drove a lot of routes through New Mexico, especially at night because traffic was lighter and the temperatures were less demanding on the truck. On the night in question, I was driving along a particularly empty stretch of Interstate 40, far from any major cities. It was already after 10 o'clock at night. The sky was clear with no rain, but there wasn't enough moonlight to illuminate the desert. Beyond the reach of my headlights, everything was practically darkness. I was alone in the cab, listening to the radio and trying to stay alert for the next several hours on the road. The air conditioning was running at full blast because the daytime heat had been intense. Traffic on the highway was light. Every now and then a truck would pass in the opposite direction or a passenger car would drive by. It was an ordinary night, just like hundreds of others I had experienced throughout my career. At least that's what I believed until I saw someone standing on the shoulder. At first I assumed it was a stranded motorist with mechanical problems. As I got closer, I realized it was a woman standing alone. She was holding a medium-sized red suitcase and signaling toward passing vehicles with her arm. That immediately struck me as strange. It wasn't the kind of place where someone would normally be waiting for transportation. There was no gas station, town, or bus stop nearby. I continued driving for a few seconds while considering the situation. Then I decided to pull over a short distance ahead. I don't usually give rides to strangers, especially during work trips, but the situation seemed difficult. When she approached the cab, I could see she was probably around 30 years old. She looked exhausted, covered in dust, and appeared to have spent hours on the road. I asked if she was okay. She replied that she had missed a bus and needed to reach the next town to get help. Her voice was calm, but it was obvious she was nervous. After thinking about it for a few moments, I agreed to take her to a larger town that was along my route. She thanked me several times, placed the red suitcase inside the cab, and climbed in quickly. As soon as she closed the door, she began looking out the window as if she wanted to make sure nobody was watching. During the first few miles, I tried to make conversation to better understand her situation. I asked where she had come from, where she was trying to go, and whether she needed me to call someone once we found a stronger signal. Her answers were always vague. She simply said she was trying to get to Albuquerque and would figure everything else out afterward. What caught my attention most was her behavior whenever another vehicle appeared on the road. Every time headlights appeared in the rearview mirror, her entire posture changed. Her body became rigid, she looked behind us, and followed the vehicle with her eyes, until it completely disappeared. If a car passed us, she would turn her head and watch through the side window until it was out of sight. At first, I assumed she was simply frightened because she was traveling alone, but the behavior became increasingly obvious. At one point, a black SUV passed us at a normal speed. Nothing unusual about it. Even so, she gripped the seat handle so tightly that her knuckles turned white. When the vehicle disappeared into the darkness, she let out a long breath, like someone who had been holding it for several seconds. That began to make me uncomfortable. I felt like there was an entire story she was keeping hidden. About an hour later, I decided to stop at a rest area to use the restroom and grab a coffee. It was one of those simple state-maintained locations with a few truck parking spaces, public restrooms, and vending machines. The parking lot was relatively empty. There were only 2 trucks parked at one end and no activity near the main building. As soon as I parked, I noticed something strange. The woman immediately looked outside the cab and seemed alarmed. I asked if everything was okay, but she replied only that she preferred to stay inside the truck. I found that unusual, but I didn't push the issue. I got out alone and walked toward the restrooms. The air was dry and cooler than it had been on the highway. The parking lot was illuminated by tall light poles that left large patches of shadow between vehicles. When I returned a few minutes later carrying a coffee, I noticed 2 men near the rest area. I hadn't seen them when I arrived. They were standing beside a pickup truck parked several spaces away. The detail that caught my attention was that neither of them appeared interested in the facilities. Both were discreetly watching my cab. Not in an obvious way, but enough for me to notice. That was when I started feeling that the stop was about to become a problem. When I climbed back into the cab, I found the woman watching the two men through a small opening in the side curtain. As soon as I closed the door, she asked if they were still outside. The question came so quickly that it was obvious she had noticed them before I had. I said yes and asked who they were. Her reaction was immediate. The color drained from her face, and she looked down at the floor. I pressed again, saying I needed to know if there was a problem. That was when she grabbed my arm and said something that instantly made me uneasy. She asked me not to talk to them. She begged me not to tell them she was there. She didn't seem like someone trying to hide an ordinary lie. She seemed genuinely terrified. I directly asked whether those men were looking for her. For several seconds, she didn't answer. She simply continued staring out the window. Then she said she needed to leave that place before they got any closer. The more she spoke, the more I felt trapped in the middle of a situation that had nothing to do with me. I didn't know whether she was a victim of something or whether she was trying to involve me in a serious problem. But one thing was obvious. She was genuinely frightened by the presence of those two men. While we were trying to talk, I noticed movement outside. One of the men had left the pickup truck and was slowly walking across the parking lot. He wasn't heading directly toward us, but he seemed to be observing the parked vehicles as he moved. The other man remained near the pickup truck, looking toward the truck parking area. The woman followed every movement they made. Her breathing was quick and her hands trembled slightly. That was when she finally revealed a little more. She said only that she was running from dangerous people and couldn't go back with them. She didn't explain who they were or why. Before I could ask another question, I saw in the side mirror that the man walking through the lot had changed direction. Now he was clearly heading toward my truck. My heart immediately started racing. I was alone, parked in a relatively empty rest area during the middle of the night, with a terrified woman inside the cab and a stranger approaching. The man reached the side of the truck and stopped near the doorstep. He didn't knock. He didn't call out. He simply stood there for a few seconds looking up, as though trying to confirm who was inside the cab. It was one of the strangest situations I have ever experienced in all my years on the road. I remained motionless, watching the man through the mirror while trying to decide what to do. The woman was so tense that she seemed barely able to breathe. After several seconds, the man finally knocked twice on the cab door. They weren't aggressive knocks. In fact, they seemed almost too polite for the situation. I lowered the window only a few inches, keeping the door locked. The man stepped back and asked whether I was transporting a woman carrying a red suitcase. My stomach dropped immediately. He wasn't looking for someone at random. He knew exactly who he was searching for. I asked who he was. The man replied that he was trying to help a friend who had disappeared earlier that night. As he spoke, his tone remained extremely calm, maybe even too calm. I looked at the woman. She was shaking her head over and over, silently begging me not to believe him. The situation became even more confusing because nothing about the man's behavior seemed threatening. At the same time, her reaction was one of pure panic. I had no way of knowing who was telling the truth. The man then asked only that she step out and talk. That was when the woman began repeating in a low voice that she couldn't go back with them. Before I could respond, another detail caught my attention. The second man had left the pickup truck and was positioning himself on the opposite side of the truck, outside my main field of vision. That completely changed my perception of the situation. If they simply wanted to talk, there was no reason to surround the vehicle. The man beside the door noticed that I had seen something and immediately continued talking. He said there had been a misunderstanding and that they only wanted to take her home. The explanation didn't convince me. I've spent a long time on the road, and I've learned to trust my instincts when something feels wrong. Without responding, I started the truck. The man noticed the engine running, and for the first time, his expression changed. He didn't become angry, but the calmness disappeared. At that moment, the woman grabbed my arm and begged me to leave immediately. I didn't know who she was. I didn't know her story, and I had no idea what was really happening. But I knew I didn't like the way those two men were behaving in that nearly empty rest area in the middle of the night. As soon as I put the truck in motion, the man quickly stepped away from the door. I didn't argue or ask any more questions. I simply pulled out of the parking space and headed for the exit. In the mirror, I saw both men running back toward their pickup truck. A few seconds later, they left the parking lot as well. That was when the situation became truly serious. As soon as we re-entered the highway, the pickup truck's headlights appeared behind us. At first, they maintained a normal distance, then they gradually began closing in. I knew that stretch of road well and knew there was a truck stop about 20 minutes ahead. My plan was simple: keep driving until I reached a populated location. The woman remained silent almost the entire time. The only sounds inside the cab were the engine, the low volume of the radio, and her breathing, which remained fast and uneven. Several times I checked the mirrors and saw the pickup truck still behind us. It never attempted to pass. It never left our tail. It simply stayed behind the truck. That completely eliminated any thought of coincidence. They were following us. The only question was why. When I finally saw the truck stop lights in the distance, I felt an enormous sense of relief. It was one of those large truck centers open 24 hours a day, full of vehicles, employees, and security cameras. As soon as I entered the parking lot, I saw dozens of trucks parked there and plenty of activity around the main store. The pickup truck entered behind us, but something different happened. Before I had even finished parking, a state police cruiser that was already on the property began driving through the lot. I don't know whether it was a coincidence or not. The fact is, the pickup truck immediately slowed down. Instead of approaching us, it drove a loop around the parking area and headed toward the exit. I watched until it disappeared back onto the highway. Only then did the woman seem to relax for the first time since I had met her. She asked to use my phone and called someone who was apparently already waiting for her in that town. About 40 minutes later, a couple arrived at the truck stop to pick her up. Before leaving, she thanked me repeatedly, but she still refused to explain exactly who those men were or why she was running from them. I didn't insist. Honestly, maybe I didn't even want to know. What I do know is that after so many years traveling the roads of the American Southwest, very few situations have made me as uncomfortable as that night in New Mexico. To this day, I have no idea whether I helped someone escape a real danger or whether I became involved in something far bigger than I ever understood. Story 4. This happened to me in 2019, when I was working as a sales representative for an agricultural equipment company. I lived in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, but spent much of the week traveling between small towns across the state visiting clients. It was a job that required many hours on the road, especially in rural areas. At the time, I already knew the region's secondary highways well and was used to driving during the early morning hours to arrive early for the next day's appointments. On the night in question, I had finished a meeting later than expected and decided to keep driving instead of sleeping at a motel. The weather was humid, typical of southern Louisiana, and a light fog was forming over the fields near the road. Traffic was practically non-existent. For several minutes, I didn't see another vehicle. The only light came from my own headlights and the occasional distant lights of farms scattered far away. I was driving along a narrow rural road surrounded by trees and wetlands when I saw two people waving from the shoulder. As I got closer, I realized it was a couple. There was a car stopped a few yards behind them with the hood raised. The man was waving his arms while the woman stood beside the road. I stopped to understand what was happening. The man explained that the car had developed mechanical problems and that their phones had no signal. He said they needed to reach a gas station several miles ahead to ask for help. The problem was that my car was full of samples, catalogs, and boxes of work materials scattered across the back seat. There was no room for two people. I explained the situation and said I could take only one of them. The man looked at the woman for a few seconds and then suggested that I take her to the gas station while he stayed behind with the vehicle. That seemed reasonable. The woman quickly thanked me, got into the passenger seat, and closed the door. Before pulling away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the man standing beside the car, watching us leave. At that moment, it all seemed like a normal roadside situation. I had no idea that only a few minutes later I would begin wishing I had never stopped there. For the first few minutes, the conversation was normal. She thanked me again for helping and commented that this kind of problem always seemed to happen at the worst possible moments. I agreed, and we continued making small talk about the weather, the roads in the area, and how difficult it was to get cell service in some rural parts of Louisiana. Little by little, however, the conversation began to shift. Instead of talking about the car or her husband, she started asking me increasingly specific questions. First, she asked whether I usually traveled alone. Then she wanted to know how many towns I visited each week. After that, she asked whether I carried cash during my trips. That immediately caught my attention. I answered vaguely and tried to change the subject. A short while later, she asked which gas stations in the region stayed open all night. Then she asked which nearby towns had police stations open at that hour. After that, she wanted to know which routes I normally use to avoid traffic. The further the conversation went, the more I felt those questions were not simple curiosity. They sounded like the kind of information someone was deliberately trying to collect. I continued answering only what was necessary while paying attention to the road and trying to understand where this was going. About 10 minutes later, something happened that made me even more uncomfortable. While driving along a long, straight stretch surrounded by trees, I casually glanced at the side mirror. Far behind my car, headlights were appearing. That alone didn't mean anything. After all, it was a public road. The strange detail was that even after several minutes, the vehicle maintained exactly the same distance. It did not get closer or fall behind. I kept watching from time to time. Whenever the road curved, the headlights reappeared in the same position. Eventually, I was able to distinguish the vehicle more clearly. It looked like a dark pickup truck. That was when I noticed something else. I couldn't identify any front license plate when the lights reflected for a brief moment. Maybe it was just the angle. Maybe I hadn't seen it properly. Even so, it bothered me. I continued watching through the mirror, and that was when I noticed something even worse. The woman had noticed the pickup too. She looked back through the side window, watched the headlights for a few seconds, and then smiled discreetly. It was not a smile of relief. It was not the reaction of someone happy to see help arriving. It looked like the smile of someone who had been waiting for exactly that to happen. When our eyes met for an instant, she quickly looked forward again. That was the first time that night I felt real fear. After that smile, I started paying attention to everything she did. The atmosphere inside the car completely changed for me. Until then, I had only been uncomfortable. Now I was trying to understand whether I had made a serious mistake by stopping to help that couple. The woman seemed much more relaxed than before. Curiously, the strange questions also stopped. She spent a few minutes looking out the window while the pickup continued behind us. I watched both her and the vehicle in the mirror whenever I could. The distance remained practically identical. At one point, I casually asked whether she knew anyone in the area. Her answer came too quickly. She said no. But immediately afterward, she glanced back again toward the headlights. That did not match the behavior of someone being followed by a stranger. I decided to test something. When we reached a quiet intersection, I signaled and turned onto a secondary road that did not lead to the gas station I had mentioned earlier. It was a detour I knew because of my work. Her reaction was immediate. She looked at me and asked why I had changed routes. At the same time, the pickup made the exact same turn behind us. At that moment, I stopped believing in coincidences. My heart began to race. I did not know exactly what was happening, but I was certain the situation was not normal. I kept my voice calm and explained that I was avoiding a construction area farther ahead. That was a lie. The woman only nodded. A few seconds later, she picked up her phone. The strange detail was that she and the man had previously claimed they had no signal in the area. Even so, she unlocked the device, glanced at the screen, and put it away again. I could not tell whether she had sent a message. I kept driving while trying to think of what to do. The pickup followed behind us without changing its distance. Then the woman asked a question that put me even more on alert. She wanted to know how much longer it would take to reach the next gas station, and whether there were usually employees working there all night. I answered vaguely. The more she spoke, the more I felt she was evaluating something. Maybe how many witnesses there would be at the location. Maybe how much activity she would find there. I truly did not know. What I did know was that I needed to get somewhere populated as quickly as possible. For the first time that night, I began looking not just for a gas station, but for any place where there would be other people nearby. Fortunately, I knew that area well because of my work trips. A few miles ahead, there was a large truck stop open 24 hours a day. I kept driving toward it while pretending to act normally. The woman remained calm the entire way, which only increased my concern. Every time I looked in the mirror, the pickup was still behind us. It did not speed up. It did not pass. It simply followed. When I finally saw the truck stop lights appearing in the darkness, I felt enormous relief. The parking lot was relatively full for that hour. There were trucks fueling, a few pickup trucks parked, and several people entering and leaving the convenience store. As soon as I signaled to turn into the place, I noticed a change in the woman's expression. For the first time, she looked displeased. She said nothing, but her smile disappeared immediately. I parked near the main entrance, directly beneath the brightest lights at the station. Before I even turned off the car, I saw the pickup enter the parking lot right behind us. My heart started pounding again. I still did not know who those people were or what their plan was, but I was certain everything was connected. That was when I made a simple decision. I got out of the car immediately, grabbed my work folder, and walked straight into the store without waiting for the passenger. As I entered, I discreetly told an employee that I was uncomfortable with the situation and asked him to call the local police if anything seemed wrong. When I looked through the window, I saw the woman get out of the car and walk toward the pickup. She did not look surprised. In fact, she looked like she was meeting someone she had been expecting. One of the occupants got out of the vehicle, and the two of them spoke quickly near the fuel pumps. A few seconds later, another person stepped out of the pickup and began looking around the parking lot. I could not hear any of the conversation, but the entire scene made me uneasy. I stayed inside the store until I saw a police cruiser pull into the station about 10 minutes later. As soon as the people in the pickup noticed the police arriving, they all got back into the vehicle and left quickly. The woman went with them. None of them tried to speak to me again. I never found out who they really were or why that couple had been standing on that rural road in the middle of the night. I also never found out why the woman seemed so interested in money, routes, and business hours of places in the area. But to this day, I believe that car trouble probably did not happen the way they told me. And whenever I remember that smile when she saw the pickup appear behind us, I'm convinced I was being led into a situation I barely managed to escape. Story 5. This happened to me in late summer of 2021. At the time, I was 27 years old and working as a freelance photographer in Eugene, Oregon. I spent a lot of time traveling alone through rural areas of the state, photographing landscapes, old farms, and small towns for personal projects and commercial work. That weekend, I had spent 2 days exploring more remote regions in eastern Oregon and was heading back home. It was a long drive, and I had chosen several secondary roads because I liked stopping occasionally to take photos. I had already been driving for several hours when the sun began to set. The temperature was dropping and the sky had that typical orange glow of late afternoon. Traffic on the highway was minimal. For miles, I hardly saw another vehicle. I was tired, but I still had several hours of driving ahead of me. It was on a particularly isolated stretch that I spotted a man walking alone along the shoulder of the road. He appeared elderly, wearing a heavy jacket despite the relatively mild weather and carrying only a small duffel bag. The sight caught my attention because there was no town nearby. He seemed completely out of place in that location. I initially drove past him without stopping. A few minutes later, I started thinking that he might need help. The area was extremely empty, and night was approaching quickly. Eventually, I turned around and pulled onto the shoulder a short distance ahead. When the man approached, I realized he was probably somewhere between 60 and 70 years old. He had gray hair, a weathered face, and spoke calmly. I asked if everything was okay. He replied that he was trying to reach a town that was along my route and asked if I could give him a ride for a few miles. I agreed, and he got into the passenger seat. For the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. We talked about the weather, the rural areas of the region, and how empty those roads became at night. What started to catch my attention was how much he knew about the area. Not just the main towns or the better-known highways. He talked about specific dirt roads, old bridges, abandoned properties, and forgotten trails, as if he had spent decades exploring every corner of that region. Some of his descriptions were so detailed that they seemed impossible. At one point, he even mentioned an abandoned farm that I had photographed earlier that day. It was a hidden place I had found almost by accident. When I asked how he knew about it, he simply smiled and said that he knew those roads better than any map. As the trip continued, the conversation became increasingly strange. I enjoy photographing abandoned places, so naturally I became interested when he started mentioning old properties in the area. At first I thought I was simply listening to stories from someone who had lived there for a long time, but I soon realized it was different. The man described hidden access roads, closed-off routes, and structures that did not even appear on the navigation apps I normally used. Several times, he referenced extremely specific landmarks. He talked about fallen trees near old fences, abandoned corrals, and wooden bridges that supposedly had not been used in years. The detail that stood out most was the confidence with which he spoke. He did not seem to be trying to impress anyone. He simply seemed to know all of it. At one point, he mentioned a property hidden within a denser section of forest, far from the main routes. He said there was an old road leading to it, but that it no longer appeared on modern maps. I asked what was on the property. He replied only that it was an interesting place for someone who liked photographing old buildings. Then he changed the subject. I found it curious but did not think much of it at the time. During my travels, I had already encountered many forgotten roads that did not appear correctly in navigation apps. The situation began to change about 40 minutes later. I was driving along a secondary highway surrounded by hills and forested areas when I noticed that my GPS started malfunctioning. First, the map froze. Then my location disappeared completely. That was not unusual in that region. Cell service often fluctuated. I casually commented that the GPS had lost connection. As soon as I said that, the man turned his head toward me for the first time in several minutes. Then he pointed to a narrow dirt road that appeared a few miles ahead and said I should turn there. According to him, it was the very road that led to the property he had mentioned earlier. I laughed and replied that I needed to continue home. That was when something changed in his behavior. It was not an aggressive reaction. It was more subtle than that. He insisted. He said I would save time by using that route. I explained again that I had no interest in making detours. A few seconds later, I heard a metallic click coming from the passenger side. Instinctively, I looked at the door. The man had discreetly engaged the manual door lock beside him. It may sound like a small detail, but I immediately felt a knot form in my stomach. When I turned my eyes back to the road, I realized he was no longer acting like someone who simply needed a ride. Now he seemed like someone waiting for a specific answer from me. I tried to act as though I had not noticed what he had done. My first reaction was to search for an innocent explanation. Maybe he had accidentally touched the lock. Maybe I was overreacting because of the discomfort I had already been feeling. Even so, I became much more alert. I continued driving normally while thinking about what to do. The man returned to talking about the dirt road. He said it was safe, that I would encounter no traffic, and that I would reach my destination faster. The problem was that none of that made sense. I had traveled through that region many times and knew that shortcuts through rural roads rarely saved time. Besides, he seemed far too insistent. Every time I changed the subject, he brought the conversation back to the same road. At one point, he even pointed ahead and said the entrance was approaching. I glanced at him and noticed something that made me even more uncomfortable. The friendly tone he had maintained throughout the trip had practically disappeared. His expression was serious, and his eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. The silence inside the car became heavy. I could hear only the engine, the tires rolling over the pavement, and the wind striking the body of the vehicle. When the entrance to the road finally appeared, I slowed down slightly because there was a curve just beyond it. The man interpreted that as a sign that I was going to turn. Immediately, he began giving me directions. He told me to turn right and continue for a few miles. That was when I firmly replied that I would not be doing that. I was staying on the main highway. What happened next was what truly scared me. He did not argue, he did not insist, he did not become angry. He simply fell completely silent. The change was so abrupt that I noticed it instantly. For the next several minutes, he stared out the window without saying a single word. I discreetly watched his movements in the reflection of the glass. At one point, I noticed that his hand remained close to the door lock. That was when I made a decision. Instead of continuing along the shortest route home, I began looking for a populated place where I could stop. I did not want to confront him on an empty road. I also did not want to wait to discover his intentions if we became even more isolated. The only thing I knew was that I needed to end that ride safely. Fortunately, I remembered a small town a few miles ahead. It was not large, but it had a gas station, a diner, and a few businesses that stayed open later than most. I continued driving toward the lights that were beginning to appear in the distance. Meanwhile, the man remained completely different from the person I had picked up earlier. For nearly half an hour, he had talked nonstop about roads, properties, and stories from the region. Now he said absolutely nothing. The silence was so strange that I could feel the tension building inside the vehicle. When the first buildings of the town appeared, I felt an enormous sense of relief. I slowed down and pulled into the brightly lit parking lot of a gas station that was still busy for that hour. There were customers fueling their vehicles, employees working, and several people sitting near the convenience store. As soon as I stopped the car, I unlocked all the doors using the central controls and told him that I needed to end the trip there. The man did not respond immediately. He simply stared forward for a few seconds. Then he opened the door, picked up his small duffel bag, and got out with the same calm demeanor he had displayed when he first entered the car hours earlier. I thought that would be the end of the story. But before closing the door, he leaned back into the car and said one final thing. He told me that I should have taken that road because I might not get another opportunity to see what was there. He did not say it in a threatening way. In fact, he sounded almost disappointed. Then he closed the door and began walking across the parking lot without looking back. I remained watching through the windshield for a few moments. The strange part was what happened afterward. Instead of entering a business or looking for help, he simply crossed the gas station and disappeared into the darkness behind a few nearby buildings. I stayed there for several more minutes before continuing my trip. When I finally arrived home that night, my curiosity was still bothering me. Over the next few days, I tried to locate the supposed hidden property using maps, satellite imagery, and public records from the region. I never found anything that exactly matched the description he had given. I also could not identify the specific road he wanted me to take. Maybe it existed. Maybe it did not. What I do know is that during that entire trip through rural Oregon, nothing frightened me more than the sudden change in that man's behavior when he realized I would not go where he wanted me to go. To this day, whenever I photograph isolated rural areas, I still think about that dirt road and the way he seemed determined to make me drive down it. Story 6. I'm a nurse and work at a regional hospital in the state of Arkansas. This happened to me in the fall of 2022, after one of the most exhausting shifts I can remember. I had just finished 12 straight hours of work, and all I wanted was to get home, take a shower, and sleep. I lived in a small town about 40 minutes from the hospital, so I usually took a rural highway to avoid traffic in the busier areas. That night, the weather was terrible. It had been raining heavily since early afternoon, and when I left the hospital parking lot, conditions seemed even worse. Rain constantly pounded the windshield, and the wipers could barely keep up. The temperature had dropped significantly, and in some areas, a light fog was beginning to form over the fields near the road. Traffic was practically non-existent. I was driving alone, listening to the sound of the rain hitting the car and trying to stay focused despite my exhaustion. It was on a particularly isolated stretch of road that I saw a figure walking along the roadside. As I got closer, I realized it was a teenager. He looked to be somewhere between 15 and 17 years old. He was completely soaked and walking very close to the lane because that section of road had no shoulder. The situation immediately caught my attention. There were no houses nearby, no gas stations, and certainly no reason for someone that age to be walking alone in the middle of the night during a storm. I passed him at first, but a few seconds later I decided to turn around. I carefully pulled over and lowered the window just enough to ask if he needed help. The boy seemed hesitant before answering. He quickly looked back toward the dark road behind him and then asked where I was headed. I explained that I was going to my town and could drop him off somewhere safe along the way. After a few seconds of silence, he got into the car. As soon as he closed the door, I realized how frightened he was. His breathing was rapid, his clothes were covered in mud, and he kept looking repeatedly through the rear window. I asked if everything was okay. He only replied that he needed to keep moving farther away from that area. At that moment, I assumed he was running from some family problem or difficult situation at home. I had no idea that this would become the strangest night I had ever experienced outside the hospital. During the first few minutes, I tried talking to him the same way I would with any teenager in distress. I asked if he was injured, if he needed medical attention, or if he wanted me to call someone. His answers were always short. He would simply say he was fine, or that he did not need that kind of help. What really caught my attention was the fact that he did not want to stop anywhere. When I mentioned that there was a gas station open farther down the road, he immediately said he did not want to go there. A few minutes later, I brought up a small town that was on our route and suggested it might be safer to get help there. He refused that as well. The more I tried to find a reasonable solution, the more worried he seemed. At one point, he specifically asked me not to leave him at any gas station, restaurant, or crowded place. That started to make me uncomfortable. I wanted to help him, but I also needed to understand what was going on. The boy kept looking through the rear window every few seconds. His hands trembled slightly and his body remained rigid in the seat. Something was clearly wrong, but I still believed I was simply dealing with someone frightened by a complicated family situation. About 15 minutes later, I noticed the first headlights behind us. The rain was still coming down hard, and the road remained almost completely empty. At first, I paid little attention because it was the first vehicle we had seen after several miles without traffic. But I soon noticed something strange. The pickup truck was approaching far too quickly. Within moments, it was right on our rear bumper. I assumed the driver simply wanted to pass, but that never happened. Instead, the truck stayed directly behind us. When I looked in the mirror, I saw that the boy had noticed it too. His reaction was immediate. The color drained from his face and he completely turned around to watch the headlights through the rear window. I asked if he knew that vehicle. For several seconds, he did not answer. He continued staring behind us while the truck maintained the same pressure. Then he finally said something that made my stomach drop. "If they find me, they'll say I'm part of their family." I immediately looked at him, trying to understand what that meant. But before I could ask another question, the pickup accelerated even more and moved so close to the back of my car that I could barely see its headlights in the mirror. At that moment, all my exhaustion disappeared. My entire focus shifted to the road and the vehicle behind us. I asked the boy who those people were and why they would claim he belonged to their family. He took several seconds to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was trembling. He simply said that he could not go back with them. He did not explain anything else. The situation became even more concerning when the pickup started behaving aggressively. First, it flashed its high beams repeatedly. Then it began moving closer and backing off as if trying to intimidate me. I had driven thousands of miles on rural roads and had never seen someone behave like that without a reason. I checked my phone, hoping to get a signal to call the police. Nothing. Not a single bar of service. The rain continued hammering the windshield and visibility was getting worse by the minute. The boy kept looking behind us nonstop. There was genuine fear in his expression. He did not seem like someone making up a story. He looked like someone who truly believed he was about to be caught. That was when I started considering the possibility that the pickup was not simply following our car. Maybe it was looking specifically for him. A few minutes later, the situation became completely abnormal. The pickup changed lanes and pulled alongside us for a few seconds. Because of the rain and darkness, I could not clearly see who was driving. All I could make out was a silhouette behind the wheel. Then the vehicle dropped back behind us. Shortly afterward, it repeated the maneuver. This time, it came even closer to the side of my car. My heart immediately started racing. I could hear the sound of water being thrown from the truck's tires as it approached. The boy shrank into his seat and begged me not to stop under any circumstances. Before I could respond, I felt a light impact against the rear of my car. It was not a hard hit, but it was enough to make one thing clear. This was not an accident. The pickup was deliberately making contact with us. I gripped the steering wheel tightly and fought to keep control of the vehicle on the wet road. A few seconds later, the truck moved alongside us again. This time, it seemed to be trying to push me toward the muddy shoulder. That was when I realized this was no longer just a pursuit. Whoever was driving that pickup was willing to cause an accident to stop us. I was terrified by that point. The road was narrow, the rain reduced visibility, and I had a terrified teenager beside me while a pickup truck tried to force us off the road. I desperately searched for any sign of civilization. Fortunately, I was somewhat familiar with that route because of work. I remembered there was a small sheriff's substation in a nearby town, although I was not sure whether it operated throughout the night. Even so, it was the only option I could think of. I kept the car moving at the fastest speed I considered safe under those conditions. The pickup continued alternating between tailgating us and attempting to move alongside us. At one point, I spotted a sign marking the entrance to the town. The boy saw it too. For the first time since getting into my car, he seemed to show a little hope. The rain was still pouring, but the first town lights appeared ahead. I drove straight toward the center of town without even slowing down. If those people were truly after him, I wanted to reach the most public place possible. Once we entered town, the situation changed quickly. There were a few convenience stores still open, streetlights, and most importantly, other vehicles on the road. The pickup continued following us for several more blocks. Then I saw something that probably saved us that night. A sheriff's patrol vehicle was parked at an intersection near a convenience store. As soon as the pickup approached the brightly lit area where the patrol car was clearly visible, it abruptly slowed down. I continued driving until I parked almost directly beside the deputies. Before even turning off the engine, I got out and quickly explained what was happening. When I looked back again, the pickup was already turning onto another street and disappearing from the area. The deputies spoke separately with me and with the boy. I later learned that he really had been trying to reach a safe location, and that there was an investigation involving his family situation. No one ever told me all the details, and honestly, I did not want to push for answers. What I do know is that the officers appeared to take his story very seriously. That morning, after giving my statement, I finally went home. To this day, I still remember the way that boy kept looking through the rear window, long before the pickup truck ever appeared. It is something I have never forgotten. Because looking back now, I get the feeling that he already knew exactly who was coming after him, long before I noticed anything at all.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.